Mojo Monday, sir. How are you?
I'm awesome. Thanks, Brett. Mojo Monday to you too.
This is ironic because we always start our Mojo Mondays with music, and music's very emotional, right? Like, I love music and it gets me going, and that's why we always start with music. Yet our topic today is going to be emotion versus logic. And
Mm.
in that sense, I think music really kind of speaks to the emotion, but sometimes the words make you think. And in a good song and a good song lyric gets you into your headspace, and that's just a good little start to our conversation. So set us up, Rick. What are we talking about today? Logic versus emotion.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing we all agree upon is that times are changing, and the only constant is change in life, whether it's personal, family, health, work, environment, even obviously the political climate, there's a million things. Even right now, the economic state of the union, is suspiciously teetering on a recession, if not already in one. And so some of the underbelly of the conversation today is about how do you convert emotion, negative emotion into positive, and then ultimately, what's the intellectual side? And logic is connected closely to intellect and your brain power. So how do you separate those and make sure they become a force of nature to your benefit?
Perfect. The way I think about it is when change happens, you could use the word shift, you could use the word change, anything in life happens. We as human beings typically show up emotionally first. And we're going to have an emotional reaction. There could be fear, it could be excitement, it could be sorrow. There's so many emotions that we show up with when things happen in life. And that's just because we're human, right? Like, we're gonna show up emotionally first almost every time. And then the question is, why is it important to process that emotion and get to logic? And you talk about the two different spaces in the brain. Why don't you give that conversation real quick, because I think it's important.
Yeah. So one thing to clarify first is that the word motion is in the word emotion.
Right.
So just contextually, you're not going anywhere without it. It's like fuel. And then so the bigger question is, how is your intellectual approach to that emotion, or is that emotion serving or disserving you? And then how can you trigger enough intellectual context to be able to frame that in a positive way? People make decisions all the time that are not rational and not supportive of their cause or purpose or who and what they are. And it's largely, like you said, emotion driven. So your brain's comprised of capacity to think intellectually, which is logic. And it's also wired with a lot of emotional energy that flows in and out of it. And what I've learned is that you can't, there's really not room for both at the same time at their peak. You could be balanced potentially, which is ideal, where you have emotional energy that drives you, intellectual energy that helps dictate it's kind of like the rudder on your boat. That's the logic side of it. But the challenge becomes when emotion swells to an extreme, intellect usually gets pushed to the curb. It's a silly example, but if you've ever been in a raging loud argument with somebody and you're both, you keep ratcheting up the energy and the intensity and the volume. I've yet to have someone at the, an 8, 9, or 10 on the meter of emotional energy stop mid-sentence and go, "Hey, I think you're right. You're spot on." We're too vested in that emotional wave. It's like a tsunami. And so, the real question is, how do you mitigate the tsunami long enough to apply some logic so that if you were in the wrong or there's a course correction possible, your brain helps dictate where that wave lands. It doesn't hit shore and crash houses. You surf it into your perfect self.
Absolutely. I'll give some silly examples, but like, the inflation went high in the US economy, so gas prices went high. Well, you've probably seen it on social media like I have. People are very emotional around these gas prices getting high. Well, there's an emotion to that. But what we realize is, I'm not sure a lot of people are buying less gas these days. They just logically restructure their budget inside of their household income, and they're still paying those gas prices. Well, if you think about that in relation to interest rates, we're emotional that the rates went up. But I promise you, people are just going to get used to paying those interest rates going forward. History tells us that's exactly what happens. But the initial rise, the initial change creates an emotional reaction. Could be fear, could be anger. Like I said, all those emotions start boiling when things change. But at the end of the day, we logically just figure out how to make that fit for us, and it becomes norm again. And right now, that's kind of the realistic part of our industry. Is there's some emotion in the consumer, there's some emotion in the agent, there's emotion in the broker around, hey, these rates have gone up. What's that really mean?
Right. Well, to your point, we don't like change. Humans just traditionally don't embrace it. And it's easy to have a visceral emotional reaction to something that looks like uncertainty. And so, but to your point, we're extremely resilient and we tend to, adapt or get creative. But the only reason that creative energy, occurs is because someone applies intellectual analysis. You look at it from a logic-based side. Emotion, remember, emotion's in emotion. That can drive you to or from, a better outcome. And
Yeah.
so as a human being that cares about others, it's really important how you frame it, because you might affect the way they see it, which ultimately tips the scales in which direction that emotion drives things.
Yeah.
And rates being a great example, don't let 1 or 2 percentage points affect or change the trajectory of your lifestyle, your family's experiential. And, most of us could potentially just reorient our budget, and you can pull out a T-square and go pros, cons. Hey, well, interest is tax deductible. So, 35% of that theoretically is gifted back in, tax benefit. So it's all about intellectually staging a response to that emotional energy that gives you a better outcome.
Yeah. A friend of ours, an investor in some of our offices, Sean Rawls, put on social media recently, he said, marry the house, date the rate. Well, the words matter, the language matters. And that analogy is a very intellectual, logical approach to the fact that the rates went up. And
Right.
when you frame things and you give the great language to it, and in the analogy, it helps people process and move forward. They're like, oh, okay, I guess dating means not forever. Marrying means forever. Well, I want the house. I'll date the rate and refinance later. Okay, now I'm logically thinking about my position, or as a consumer, or maybe I'm an agent helping a consumer logically think about it. But at the end of the day, it's a logical approach to a change that we could be caught in emotion around.
Absolutely. Well, you prioritized what's most important, and then you didn't let the minor detriments dictate a decision around what's most important. And again, inside of what story you're sharing is that obviously marrying a home means an experience, and it means an uplift, and it means a better life for you and those that you love, and for your friends. And so if you bring it back to that boil it down, and then you kind of play the worst case scenario. And in this example, rates are never, again, the only constant is change. And, they probably will come down again, or we'll modify our approach to it to create a winning formula, because lenders are probably having a freak out moment going, gosh, what if, sales go down, and what if, but, the industry itself takes care of itself. And over time, it might be an arm or an adjustable or some sort of creative financing strategy that helps you win, but intellect will catch up with the right emotional swell.
Absolutely. And I want to throw another layer to this, is community. So a lot of times when we find ourselves in an emotional state, if we're just keeping that conversation internal, it can swell, right? But when you dive into the community, whether it's a group of peers, or mentors, or people that have lived maybe before you and lived through some things before you, that community, if it's a great community, should help you find the logical response, the logical approach to where we're going. And Rick, I mean, this is exactly the conversations we're having with our leaders right now. Is great leaders help people respond logically to change or shift, or whatever word you want to put in there, because there is opportunity in every circumstance. But if you're caught up in your emotions, you'll miss it.
Well, and you said reach out to the community. Just be careful which community you're reaching out to, because there are people who really, they almost feed on negative energy. They almost feed on the narrative that's, the cutting edge, or in the media, it's bleeding edge. So my advice there is reach out to a community of people you know and respect, to your point, that have succeeded and thrived in spite of circumstances, who've been there long enough to know it, who went through the last major crisis, the 08, 9, 10, 11, and even before that. And people forget, in the early 80s, I mean, interest rates were in the high teens and close to 20%. I mean, can you imagine all of a sudden 4, 5, 6% looks like a steal and a deal? My first house, by the way, I was locked in at 8.25%. And the day before closing, I had one float down built into it. It dropped to 8. I thought I'd won the lottery. I was doing cartwheels, stolen money from the lender, got the best deal on the planet. And to your point, it's all perspective.
Absolutely. And, the thing that I'm laughing about right now is we sound like we might have that. I walked both ways uphill 2 miles to school in snow and ice perspective, but that's really what a community does. And the wise people, the people that have lived before us, kind of simplify the emotional moment of right now, right? And we may make fun of it, but at the same time, that wisdom and that experience is what you need to navigate waters when you're in an emotional state. The other thing that I think is really important, and I want to kind of take us down this conversation, is how do you process your emotional state? And if you get caught up into an emotional state, and it could be around interest rates today, it could have been around gas prices, it could have been around, Rick, I think you're about to publish a book, right? Like, I'm sure there's some emotion around that. The question is what are the great questions you need to be asking yourself? Because when you ask yourself great questions, you're forcing your brain to leave that emotional state and move to a place of intellect, because you have to think to answer great questions. Frame that up for me a little bit.
First of all, I hope you guys heard that. That's probably the most important thing we'll say today, is that, the better the question, the better the response. And so, there's a book out by John Maxwell called Thinking for a Change. It's a business book, but his contention is we spend far too little time in an intellectual meditative state of just really stopping and analyzing without reacting or acting. And so first step to me is pull out a piece of paper. And if you want to ask a better question, go ahead and list the things that are fear-based, and then list the things that are opportunity-based, and see where you land. And then, to your point, let your brain kind of meander about the intellectual or logical side, so that your emotion gets excited about something on the positive checklist side. And, inside of that. And sometimes, by the way, the detrimental side really is daunting, and really is. And so my advice then is circle the negative, and then list underneath it, what's the silver lining attached, the opportunity to grow, then fail forward, or what, even frame that positively, honor the positive, and then mitigate the negative with some logic-based reason that it has merit. And as silly as this sounds, sometimes I actually apply, hey, my failure, my experience, my running through this season, it might actually not be all about me. There might be somebody in my world, either a peer, a family member, someone in our work sphere, that benefits from watching me, honor the struggle and make, lemonade. And so it may not, the world's more complicated than just a myopic, snapshot from a Polaroid camera.
Yeah.
And so make a list, find the silver lining. Where's the opportunity? What's my lesson in this? That's always served me incredibly well. But then do something with it. Don't just let the lesson be a recurring Groundhog Day pain point.
So, Rick, I'm going to challenge you to be a little vulnerable for a minute. You've been telling me about this book you're going to publish forever, and I know there's some emotion attached to that. How do you help yourself process the emotion? Give me some real world conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and forever, by the way, is a long time. Thank you for framing it in such positive.
I'm sorry. Now you're emotional, but keep going.
Well, because there's the so we all assign value to an experience. And then that assigned value creates the emotion. So for me, writing a book is probably the most vulnerable place I could ever live. We can have a conversation, man. And I know, and you know, that people are going to benefit from this. And there's a little more shelf life thanks to social media and YouTube, and all the sources that house this stuff. But there's a billion conversations going on. Most of them fade away. Nothing's more permanent than print. You put your name on something, sign, stamp, and deliver it in a product. All of a sudden, it's like I got into this analysis paralysis loop. And even though I was consistently improving and writing, I found myself writing and rewriting and not necessarily making it better. And I had to stop and kind of go, how is this serving me? What's the advantage?
I want to stop you for a second.
Do it.
What I just heard you say is that's the emotional state you have around putting something in print, putting your name on something. You have this emotional feeling of this permanence and this perfection, and you're caught a little bit in the analysis paralysis of your emotional state around it. Am I hearing that correctly?
You are hearing it correctly. And attached to that is the fear that it's not exactly the way, it's like in pursuit of perfection, you miss a whole lot of good and you miss all of the opportunity of executing and learning on that execution. And so back to the T-square, what's the advantage of waiting to write the perfect manuscript? And I couldn't come up with many things other than I would be more, excited about my first release. But the problem is if you don't have a first release, you can't have a second release. If you don't sell your first house, you can't get a second one. If you don't sell your first 100, you can't have your second 100. This is all a scalable mindset conversation. And so that was part of it. The other part of it is, I got to the end and I'm like, God, I want to put a bow on it. What if I need some punctuating experience? And the way I fix that is I reframe my energy that, hey, what if the last chapter of this executable that you can check box was actually the first chapter of your next experience? And by not checking it, that next one again doesn't happen, which a bit of a reiteration of what I just said, but you get the point. The last piece of it is I had some emotional energy around some of the stories I tell and the impact on the people that, that were part of my history. And some of it's, exciting, exhilarating, and awesome. And some of it was like, honest and raw. And so the way I overcame that is I sent the manuscript to the key people in my life that I felt might be, potentially emotionally charged in a negative way or not proud of some of the realities that I lived through. And, what was really validating is their response that it was, hey, it's your story. I accept those facts. And I realized that the benefit to the universe is we all become more authentically receivable. We're more, we have the ability to transcend our lives through our stories, our challenges, our detriments. And without them, the story's really boring and the story's not empowering. And unless you feel a connection with someone, you probably don't listen as closely as you could or should. And so all of those things added up means I need to publish the book. And I'm proud to say that we're down to cover art and some interior layout in the final edit. It's outside of my control. I've now delegated it to pros.
There you go. But logically, I just want to bow tie this. So I heard you talk about your emotional state first, and then I heard you move to an intellectual state or a logical state where you said, what are the things that I need to work through in my mind to where I can be super content or super happy with this experience and publish this book? And one of which was, hey, I need to diffuse the thought that I might hurt some people by sharing some personal stories. And you took action on that logically and diffused it. So that's now off the table. So now you can move forward, right?
Well, sometimes success isn't actually succeeding. It's removing obstacles.
Yeah.
And I think one of the points in our last session on Atomic Habits is removing things, speed bumps and derailments. And so when you eliminate the negative, there's only one path, and that's the path you're supposed to take. And so it's almost like what are the inhibitors? And then what's the course correction or activity that removes that inhibitor? And just that without pulling out a sheet of paper and again, leaning into your logic brain, you're going to stay in an emotional state that's charged with all kinds of uncertainty. And it's usually fear-based. And my advice is just as often as you can eliminate fear from your decision chain and your behavior choices, you'll come out a lot better.
Yep. All right. So let's move this to a challenge here.
All right.
So how do we challenge people? I think the reality is you've got to look at your life and say, where am I showing up emotionally that the emotional state that I'm in is actually keeping me from moving forward to living a bigger life? And what are maybe the questions I should be asking myself, or what is the right community I should be engaging in to process that emotion to get myself to motion and logic?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of boils down. I feel like we come back to this a lot, but your success or failure lives inside of your day planner. And so my best advice is go back and analyze the last 30 days and then circle, green where you're in your 20% that matters most, that was positively charged and highly rewarding, yellow where you're doing things that was, were part of the process, but not necessarily making you a better person or more effective or successful, and then red and logically apply a strategy, to overcome the emotion that maybe didn't, I guess, that were those roadblocks that kept you from making your highest and best decisions for an amazing, day. And then that leads to an amazing week, and that leads to an amazing month. And so it's bite-sized pieces and being analytical about the emotional drivers around behavior that leads to your success.
Yeah. I love all our conversations. This one's amazing. Thank you, because I think it's very timely. Mojo Monday, my friend.
Mojo Monday. Hope you guys have an amazing week.